Hello and welcome to CNBC TV 18. COP26 ended with a plea to all nations to accelerate efforts in order to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius. India pledged to achieve net zero emissions by 2070, combating deforestation, phasing down on coal, increasing financial support for developing countries were among the successes of COP26. But lack of commitments by certain nations towards reducing emissions was a disappointment. Now at CNBC TV 18, we've decided to put the focus on climate action with our new campaign, Sense and Sustainability. We kick off this first episode with two special guests, Mridula Ramesh, climate entrepreneur, investor and author. Also Ashwani Bhatia, Managing Director, State Bank of India. Let me first bring in Mridula Ramesh, someone who has personally invested in about 15 startups. Almost all of these investments are climate related. We will be talking to her about her new book, Watershed, which lays out how India's business landscape will be transformed by water and why water is the next great startup opportunity. Mridula Ramesh, thank you very much for joining us. We'd love to ask you about your book, which really puts water as the central crisis and also a big opportunity that India needs to focus on. And I'd like to begin with an excerpt in the beginning of your book where you said that understanding of water led to management, and management made India one of the wealthiest places in the world in ancient times. And today we ignore the facets of India's water, thereby creating fault lines. Are we respecting this resource and where are we as far as the water crisis goes? Mridula.
Thank you, Parikshit, and thank you for having me on the show. I think, to me, the climate crisis is a water crisis because while people who talk on climate, the conversations on climate primarily center around carbon, the climate itself speaks through water. And as the climate is heating up, the water is becoming more menacing. And for India, which is arguably the most vulnerable country to climate change, it's speaking very loudly in the rising crescendo of storms and floods and the increasing incidence of drought. But to blame the climate crisis alone is unfair because, there are existing fault lines because we forgot about the facets of India's water. What are those? India's water is highly variable, geographically variable. We talk of an average of 1,100 millimeters of rain, but there are parts of India that get 165 millimeters of rain a year. And there are parts where 5 meters of rainfall fall in a matter of months. It's seasonally variable. And that seasonality is what is really going to affect Indian businesses. India has one of the most seasonally variable rainfall in the world. And just as India's water reaches the ebb, the pre-monsoon months, the pre-summer months and the summer months, that's when industrial production is ramping up. As the year is ending and the factories are ramping up, that's when their water demand goes up. So you see this seasonality which ancient Indians understood and appreciated, but modern businesses have forgotten, and that's creating a fault line.
Right.
Now, as the climate heats up, I've gone through the other facets, but for the interest of time, I'll just stick to these two. As the climate heats up and increases water contrast within a year, industry which is centered in southern and western India, seasonality is coming to bite. And when summer rolls around, companies are finding that they may not have water in as predictable a fashion as they want. And when monsoons roll out, they find that their factories are not as safe or their workers are not as safe as they would like them to.
Right. And, when you speak about industry and business, Mridula, I'd like to quote another excerpt from your book. This was from March 2016, and this was about the Farakka Super Thermal Power Station, and several power plants within this super power station had to be shut down because there was just not enough water to cool it. Do you feel that Indian industry, Indian businesses are respecting water as a resource enough? Do you think this is something that India's regulators, India's lawmakers need to concern themselves with on priority?
Okay, so there are two questions there, and I'll try to answer each of them in turn. One is, are businesses respecting water? And I think the answer lies in the absence of water in the income sheet and the balance sheet and the income statement. That is what managing directors look at, and that's what managing directors are tasked to manage. Where do you see water appear there? Is it appearing in a meaningful way? If you can't manage a black hole, Parikshit, if you want to manage something and if you really want to respect something, it needs to appear on the annual report of the company, not in CSR spends or not in just your sustainability report, but in the mainstream of your business. And the unfortunate answer is for many Indian businesses, that's not the case. And for what is an existential risk and what is a foundational issue, this this disregard can become dangerous. And given the accelerating climate crisis, and I use the word accelerating, perhaps this relative deprioritization will change and water will move up. But again, the second part of your question is equally important, perhaps more important, because businesses will manage only something that is financially relevant, right? I mean, we can look at reputation, and I have spoken about the reputation of water, etc., and the reputational risks of mismanaging water. But finally, you're going to manage something, you're going to innovate on something, only something which has a price. And I think India is losing a trick because we've forgotten about this. And again, going back to our history, I mean, if you look from the Indus Valley civilization to Chanakya's Arthashastra to, the engineering marvels of Tamil Nadu, if you just look through India, water has always had a price. And a variable price, a price paid in kind, but it's always had a price. So if you don't signal value, if you don't say this is something to be managed, this is something that you will be rewarded for managing, how do you expect scalable management of water across businesses, especially in the SME sector?
Right. I'd also like to ask you about India's plans to phase down on usage of coal. This was a hot topic of discussion during COP26. Many of the developed nations wanted India to agree to the terminology on phasing out of coal and fossil fuel subsidies, something that we did not agree to. But when it comes to water, challenging the reliability of coal, or harnessing the water resource well so that we can slowly phase down on coal, what is the trajectory that you see ahead?
Okay, so to me, coal and water is one of the most interesting yet underspoken about aspects of either water or coal. When you talk of coal, I mean, when the businesses talk of coal, when regulators talk of coal, when the common public speaks of coal, they think carbon, right? The coal is portrayed as a carbon villain. And those who defend coal say, look, coal-powered thermal power plants are a base source of power, which means, wind is seasonal, solar without storage, solar is available only in the day. Hydropower is seasonal. So, if it's either coal, it's gas. Gas is really expensive, or it's nuclear. And nuclear comes with its own risks. So, what is the allure of coal? The allure of coal is it's cheap and it's a base power. It's always available. But what you see in this book is that's not really the case, because coal plants that are situated in dry regions, and there are a lot of those, which are cooled with fresh water, are seeing a 21% lower plant load factor, how the utilization factor of those plants. And at that point, they're not running, they're not a reliable source of power. And that's during summers and during drought years, the El Nino years when water availability falls, these plants are seeing lower availability. The other thing is because coal is no longer interesting because it is no longer a reliable source of power in certain parts and during certain times.
Right.
And in the summer, your wind is not available and your hydropower is not available. So you're really the electricity authority is caught between the devil and the deep sea.
Right.
The second thing is because of the plummeting prices of renewable sources of power, coal is no longer the most attractive bell in the ball. So renewables are challenging coal. And what is really interesting is carbon is telling you, you need to get away from coal, but it's giving you a blunt message. But once you introduce water into the narrative, water is telling you how and where to do it. right? So you need to move away from coal. But what is the next question that comes up? Okay, which coal plants will I shut down? Where will I shut it down? Where will I move away? So what including water in the narrative is doing is giving you how to do it. Perhaps we start with coal plants in dry regions, which are already financially unappealing because of their lower plant load factor.
Mridula, you are a climate investor as well. You have invested in several startups in the country. You've also called water the biggest startup opportunity for India. What's the opportunity that you see here? What's the future?
So, Parikshit, thank you for that. I think look at Singapore and Israel, right? They have built water resilience, but they've built water resilience in the back of water entrepreneurship, right? Water startups are adding billions of dollars to their GDP and importantly, adding thousands of jobs to their country. Now, flip that around and what does that mean for India? A city like Chennai is multiple Israels put together. A city like Bombay is multiple Singapores put together. And we have some of the best brains there. And in the startups that I'm seeing, you're seeing such brilliant brains coming in and such interesting and innovative business models coming in. See what has happened to solar. Startups have transformed it, right? You see what is happening in a very nascent stage. You're seeing it happen in the management of solid waste. Agri-tech startups have just exploded. I mean, there are startups using agri-bio waste to create cooling chambers so that agri-waste goes down. You know, there are so much of our water is used by agriculture, and so much of the produce goes to waste, wasting the water that goes with it. India has nowhere enough storage to manage those, building that storage, and importantly, managing that storage.
Right.
As several startups in the book that I've mentioned too, can create hundreds of thousands of distributed rural jobs. And that is the missed opportunity. You can build water resilience and you can create the jobs that India really desperately needs.
Right. Thank you.
And what that really requires is acknowledging the value of water.
All right. Thank you, Mridula, Ramesh, for joining us and telling us why water management needs our urgent attention. With that, we take a short break here on CNBC TV 18. On the other side, we will be joined by Ashwani Bhatia, the Managing Director of State Bank of India. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. You're watching our special campaign, Sense and Sustainability. Time now to look at sustainable development goals in the banking sector and how large public sector banks can help India in cutting down on emissions and accelerate transition to renewable energy, electric vehicles and achieving net zero emissions. We're joined by Ashwani Bhatia, Managing Director of State Bank of India. Mr. Bhatia, thank you very much for joining us. Tell us about SBI's own sustainable development goals and priorities.
State Bank of India is a 2-century-old organization, and we are part of all economic cycles. And as you mentioned, the stress on sustainability development goals. What we see and the way we see the economy going forward from here, and as you correctly mentioned, the focus is going to be on EVs. The focus will be on renewables. The focus will be such that the growth from here onwards becomes sustainable. At the same time, you also have to realize that the stage of our economy currently, we are not up there as far as development is concerned. So very clearly, it is also going to be a hybrid model, an omni model, if I may use the word. But we are obviously cognizant of the fact that going forward, the business has to be sustainable. The business has to be done in such a way that we support the companies that have a lower footprint. So yes, we are getting a lot of inquiries on EVs. We are getting inquiries on batteries. And some of the larger corporates are, yes, talking about hydrogen also. And we have, of course, funded a lot of the solar parks. We have funded urban mobility. We have done all sorts of things. And even within thermal power plants, for example, we We do the flue gas desulfurication. All of those projects also we are doing so that the carbon outflow is much lower.
Right. Now, in terms of lending, tell us, Mr. Bhatia, what kind of norms, what kind of lending processes would we need if we need to achieve the renewable energy targets which have been set out by the Prime Minister, net zero emissions by 2070? If India has to become this kind of economy, if we have to accelerate climate action, what kind of lending norms do we need?
So the lending norms are going to develop, but suffice to say that currently, say over the last 3 years, we have hardly got any thermal uh, units for financing. The corporates themselves realize that if they do anything that puts them at crossroads with environment and other things, their shareholders are going to go back to them and tell them that, look, this is not right. This has happened globally with the Global Environment Fund, some sovereign funds also, where they consciously do not invest in so-called industries that lead to social harm, if I may use the word, or places where there is the carbon footprint is not so good. So I think it's not only the banks that have to do the work, but I think from the government side, the policies, from the corporates, they also have to be responsible. And from the banks, of course, we'll be very responsible in our lending going forward.
Just to speak about electric vehicles, one point that is often raised by the industry is that the interest rates for a consumer tend to be higher. There is not enough lending in the sector. These are some of the pain points that the industry has been raising. How can that be eased? And how do you see the lending for electric vehicles, one for manufacturing and one for the consumer, easing up in the next few years?
So for the consumer, I think we already have lower rates for them. But from the consumer side, also understand that it has not picked up massively or in a big way for the simple reason that charging stations are not there. So that infrastructure still needs to be built up into the system. If that happens, I'm sure, as the projections tell us, today we are less than 0.1%. By 2028 or 2030, we are talking of a number that is close to 10%. That will certainly happen. The infrastructure obviously needs to develop hand in hand. So most of the societies today don't have charging stations, for example. Another area that will obviously pick up is biofuels. Another thing that we have been working very actively with the ministries is the ethanol blending that is going to happen. And if we can reach the 20% target set by the government, that itself would be a very big achievement as far as the emissions are concerned.
The International Finance Corporation, Mr. Bhatia, had recently spoken also about the need for central banks and organizations like SEBI to set benchmarks, set rules for bank lending when it comes to climate action. Do you also feel that we need some policy clarity, certain regulations that would help banks also work towards our climate action goals?
Certainly, globally, regulators will also have to step in because finally they regulate us. So they regulate the financial markets or the capital markets as well. So the benchmarks there could be a little different from what we do currently. So we just have to wait and see.
We're still on our learning curve, but in terms of lending to large corporates, large listed companies, is sustainability and the contribution of a company towards reducing or towards climate mitigation, is that also factored in while lending to a big corporate?
It is definitely, but if you ask me whether it is part of a very active scoring model and all, that I think ecosystem still needs.
Any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with, Mr. Bhatia, because climate finance will play a crucial role as we go forward with our climate action goal. And the Prime Minister also at COP26 had been saying that we don't need $100 billion, we need at least $1 trillion per year if we need to achieve our climate action goals. So what would be your thoughts when it comes to climate financing?
We will be very much with all the policies that are enunciated by the government, and we do look to be part of this initiative. We have seen in the last few years the kind of climate events. I mean, as I said this morning, we've had a climate event in Mumbai. You wouldn't have ever got such heavy rains in the month of December. So yes, we have to work towards them. We will work with all policy formulators. We'll work with government to ensure that we achieve a net zero by 2070.
All right. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Bhatia. We've run out of time. That's all we have time for on this special campaign, Sense and Sustainability. Goodbye and thanks for watching.